Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am one of our educators at the museum. And this afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Dr. Raul Artal, a Holocaust survivor from Transnistria, share his story with you. Before we begin our program, I just want to share a few quick words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure the world would never forget their history, and they always had a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We cannot do this work today without our Holocaust survivor community, who on a regular basis shares their stories with students and various audiences on a regular basis. And throughout this last year, we have been doing this virtually, and we are so grateful for our survivor community who does this for us in order to fulfill the mission of the founders. Furthermore, we're happy to announce that the museum is now open in person, and you can follow our website, holocaustmuseumla.org, for information on how to reserve a space to get to the museum and to see it in person. Our talks are still virtual for the time being. And this summer, we are having our public talks on Fridays at 11 o'clock. We are so honored to have Dr. Raul Artal share his story with us this morning. Thank you so much for being with us and for everything that you do for us, for students on a regular basis, by sharing this story frequently so that people can learn from your story. Thank you so much, Raul, for being with us, and you may begin. So if you, on Zoom, if you go down to share screen again and click on your PowerPoint, it should come up. If you double click on the where you see your PowerPoint in the small window, that should, if you double click it, that should work.
Before. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we see it now, yes.
Okay. Is the audio on?
Yes, we can see you and hear you and see your screen, your presentation. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Raul Artal-Mittelmark. I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I'm sorry we cannot meet in person, but that's pretty close. would like to share with you my life journey. But it's important to point out that during the Third Reich reign in Europe, Nazi Germany was responsible for the death of 20 million civilians, among them 6 million Jews, of which 1.5 million were Jewish children. 1.5 million Jewish children were massacred. I was very lucky to survive, and will share with you my life journey. Transnistria, where I was born, is a geographic freak, actually a territory that was dedicated to the deportation of Jews from eastern and northern Romania, western Ukraine, and from some other places in Central Europe. This territory was given to fascist Romania as a gift by Hitler to Ioan Antonescu, the leader of the fascist leader of Romania at that time, for one purpose and one purpose only: to deport the Jews over there and eventually massacre them, but use them as slaves. I was born in a similar cowshed in Bersat, Transnistria, that housed deportees. Bersat was one among many small Jewish towns scattered in Western Ukraine. People, as I was saying, Jewish people were deported there. From there, my parents and I were moved in another structure, and will share with you later on during my presentation. I think it's important to point out that between 1933 and 1940, more than 1,400 anti-Jewish laws were passed in Germany. However, anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews was and remains pandemic, and historically resulted in the murder of and destruction of the European Jews. It's important to point out that anti-Semitism is resurging, and we know that currently in the United States, 60% of all the anti-racial activities are directed towards the Jews, although the Jews in the United States are only about 2% of the general population. The underlying psychological mechanism of scapegoating, and that's what anti-Semitism is Jews were considered to be collectively responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. There is also racial anti-Semitism. It is that general perception that Jews are just born genetically inferior. Then there is the economic anti-Semitism, that all Jews are rich. And there is the political anti-Semitism. Jews were considered communists by the Nazis, and later on bourgeois by the communists. It's very sad to know that despite the fact that 60% of the anti-racist activities in our country here is directed towards the Jews, that rarely is this topic brought up by the media. It's actually totally ignored by the media. Hitler believed the myth of the powerful Jews. And at the Wannsee conference, the final solution for the Jewish question was decided: extermination through work. And those that cannot work, just eliminate. The Jews must be finished one way or another. That was the conclusion of the Nazi leadership. It started with euthanasia programs. and directed not only towards Jews, but also towards those that had any infirmities, any congenital malformations, not necessarily Jews. However, Hitler, it's important to read this letter sent by Hitler to his personal physician, Dr. Karl Braun, and to the commander Bauchler. And they were charged with the responsibility to extend the powers of specific doctors in such a way that after the most careful assessment of their conditions, those suffering from illnesses deemed to be incurable may be granted a mercy death. Being Jewish was considered an incurable disease and a genetically inferior condition. The reality nowadays in very large genetic studies is that Jews are not genetically inferior in any way. Actually, genetic disorders are more common among Northern European than among Ashkenazi Jews, but that's just as an aside. The Nazi Germans had problems, had difficulties in identifying who was Jewish in Europe. So believe it or not, IBM came to their help, also a very little known fact. And they invented the first, one of the first computers in the world, the punch card computer. Some of you may still remember the punch card. And this is a New York Times bestseller. You can find some more details about how IBM helped Nazi Germany during World War II. Extermination camps, concentration camps, city ghettos, extermination ghettos, transit cities, and major massacres started occurring all over Europe. The place where I was born was here in Transnistria, the artificial territory that I mentioned before, the Greek geographic determination, and Bersat, Transnistria was right here in the middle, to the north of Odessa, where some horrible massacre occurred, where tens of thousands of Jews were massacred. These were my grandparents on my mother's side. My grandparents lived in a town called Kotin, Bessarabia, which is currently in Western Ukraine. And my grandfather was the mayor of the city and also pharmacist. And my grandmother had 9 children. And my mother was the youngest of the 9. Here is my mother with one colleague in the city of Chernovitz. City of Chernovitz, and the words of the poet, famous poet was that is the city where people and books lived. My mother was trained as a concert pianist, and she was also teaching piano, advanced piano at the Music Academy in Chernovitz, where she met my father during her stay there. Both my mother and my father were deported from there later on to Transnistria. This is my grandfather on the my father's side. My grandparents, prior to World War II, lived in Vienna, Austria. My grandfather, ironically, was recruited during World War II by the army of the Emperor Franz Joseph and fell as a prisoner on the Russian front, and then returned to Vienna, from where they later on ran away because the Nazis started taking over also Austria. Here is my father on the front row. with his sister to his left, and his older brother behind him, and his mother at a property that they had in Storožnje, Bukovina, where they owned a road and bridge construction company. Both my father and his brother were trained as civil engineers, and they were both ended up in concentration camp, in the same concentration camp during World War II, where I was born in Bersat. My wife's, Michal, entire family in Poland was massacred, murdered in Poland. Here are a few in the family, all murdered, disappeared. These were the killing centers all over Europe. Hundreds of killing centers, and the Jews were a primary target. Here you can see mothers, grandmothers, and children on their way to concentration camps to be loaded and like animals into these wagons. Here is a grandmother and her 3 grandchildren on the way to the gas chamber to be gassed and then burned. This is a letter that I came across from a Jewish inmate at Auschwitz that was found after the war. We were bullied out of the train and stood waiting. A truck arrived, stopped near us, and on the truck were all the women and children. In the center, my wife was standing up with our baby. The picture I will never forget. All of them were supposed to have gone to undress and then to the gas chambers. 2 hours later, these people were ashes, including my wife and child. A few years ago, I visited Auschwitz, and our youngest daughter and one of her children joined me on that trip. And here is Nava, the youngest granddaughter of ours, standing in front of a poster, a huge photograph at Auschwitz, where you can see mother and children on their way to the gas chambers. And the horrible thought occurred to me that my family could have been there. Nava, our youngest grandchild, could have been there and sent to the gas chamber. And a few hours later, all of them would have been ashes. This is a photograph that I took to Mauthausen, and each time I see it, I have tears in my eyes, because you see, it's the photograph of a wall, and you can see stretches of people trying to climb up the walls and get the last gasp of air at the Mauthausen gas chamber, where thousands of Jews were killed for one reason and one reason only: they were Jewish. At Majdanek, this is a mausoleum underneath the ashes of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. Here are what's remained of belongings of Jewish people at the Auschwitz on the rails of the trains that were bringing thousands of Jews to their death at Auschwitz. Another horrific image from Auschwitz. This carpet is made out of hair, human hair, predominantly women. And here you can see eyeglasses of thousands of victims. And these were younger Jewish men selected for slave work, just like my parents. They became slaves. We'll talk about this later. It's remarkable to see that from the windows of all these concentration camps, far away, you could see images of cities where people live normal lives. It is incredible and impossible to believe that they didn't know what was happening just a few miles from their homes. A few historical facts. Hitler's forgotten ally, barely mentioned, is Ion Antonescu, the Romania fascist dictator and leader of fascist Romania at that time. Romania occupied Bessarabia and Bukovina. For joining Hitler's Nazi Germany, he was rewarded with the territory that became Transnistria, or the exile of Jews from most of the territories. 110,000 Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina. Hundreds of people died on death marches, about 200 miles to Transnistria. There were no railroads to Transnistria from those territories. So people were herded like animals through tens to hundreds of miles to concentration camps, to slave labor camps, and extermination camps. During these marches, more than half of the victims died. Exposure, hunger, thirst, savage brutality, typhus, and also systematically killed by the Einsatzgruppe D, the Death Squad D, and the Romanian Iron Guards. Between July 1 and August 31st, 41, when my parents were deported a little bit later, the Einsatzgruppe D and the Romanian Echelon Special Unit killed about 150,000 Jews from these territories during 2 months. Estimated that about 1.2, 1.5 million or more Jews from Bukovina, Bessarabia, and Romania in the Ukraine perished during World War II. It is not really known to this day how many Jewish people died there, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. It's important to come across this order by General Walter von Reichenau, the commander of the 6th Army, the first one to invade Ukraine and these territories. And this is what he read to his soldiers and officers. And the Eastern territories, the soldier is not merely a warrior fighting according to the rules of the art of war, but also the merciless bearer of national ideology. Therefore, the soldier must comprehend the necessity of cruel and just revenge against the subhuman Jewry. The only crime they committed, they were Jews. The 6th Army, the Einsatzgruppen, the Death Squad units, and the Ukrainian auxiliary massacred during the first few days 90 children at Bila Tserkava, 90 children, they were hiding in one building. Despite objections from their attached army chaplains. The same unit that was also responsible for the camp where I was born and hiding, this same unit, the Death Squad unit, was responsible for the killing of 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar near Kiev in Ukraine, for one reason only, just revenge. Here you can see Jews being herded through on the Death March and being guarded by Ukrainian guards and Romanian fascist soldiers. Here you can see on the same Death March and Romanian soldier holding babies and followed by children. On the other hand, in other places of Europe, Hitler and non-Jewish children were celebrating. Everybody was having fun. Bogdanovka, typhus epidemics erupted, one of the first cities to be occupied by the fascist Nazi armies. And what did they do? They locked up all the Jews in these structures, and they burned them alive in one of the first days of the occupation. Death marches included a walk through the forest of Kazawoods. My parents were on this death walk. 12,500 Jews were forced through the forest, rain and sleet. About 6,000 perished just from hunger, disease, and many of them were killed for just not being able to walk. Among the deportees was a famous painter, Arnold Agani. Most of his paintings are in Jerusalem at the museum there. And this is one of his renditions, as an artist's rendition of a grandfather and his two grandchildren and the forest of Kazawut, freezing to death. The deportees were asked to dig trenches every 15 miles or so, and many of them that could not walk or that were selected would be buried, some of them not yet dead and buried alive in these trenches on the death marches. Here how those trenches looked in Ukraine, photographed at the Holocaust Museum in Poland. Other horrible things occurred while marching through these different towns and villages. The Ukrainian soldiers and the fascist Romanian soldiers will kill most of the men, order the young women to undress and paraded them through the streets of the villages and towns, paraded them naked. Then they will take them and rape them and throw them alive into limestone ovens, beatings, rapes, and random killings by these, by the cruel Nazis and their allies. This is a famous photograph also at the Holocaust Museum. The German soldiers were under strict orders to save bullets. And when they were killing mothers and children, they were asking the mother, forcing actually, to reposition the baby in such a way that the soldiers could kill with one bullet both mother and baby or child. To this day, we don't know how many Jewish people were massacred in the fields of Ukraine. And it became a project of Father Dubois, Patrick Dubois, the Vatican liaison to the Jewish communities around the world. I highly recommend this book. Father Dubois is involved in a project by trying to determine approximately how many Jews were killed there in Western Ukraine, and going to places where there are mass graves and recovering these metal detectors, the bullets, counting the bullets. He knows approximately close to the truth how many people were killed at each location. Father Dubois is a generation too late to save lives. Instead, he has saved memory and history. These are Jews, among them could be also my parents, on the bank of River Dniester before they crossed into Transnistria. Here across the River Dniester is Transnistria, the killing fields of Transnistria. Ukrainian Jews near the Dniester River before being deported to Transnistria in July of 41. My parents were deported in October of 41. Convoys of deported Jews from these towns in Bessarabia and Bukovina were deported to abandoned villages. 50 to 100 were piled out in windowless barns, stables, abandoned houses. Those fit for slave labor were kept alive. The other ones were deported. Jews died of executions, typhus, hunger, and cold. This is a photograph that I took in Bersat. Would have been the house for my parents for during World War II. People that still live there. There are only 2 Jews that were left in this small town, large village. And the Jewish ghettos, they have destroyed structures or left just like during World War II. And my parents shared a room in a similar structure with other 19 people. For a while, they were allowed to exchange their clothing for food. They were never fed. The only time they were fed is when they worked on the freeways that the Germans were building close by. And otherwise, many people, if they could not find the food, they died of starvation. My father will also sneak out of the ghetto at night into the field and dig for potatoes. This is the synagogue in Bersat. It's a few centuries old synagogue. During World War II, the Germans kept 200 Jewish people in this structure. But this is how it looks today. Bersat was in an area called Vinica. Vinica is the capital of the region, and Bersat was very close to Vinica. Vinica is famous for several things. This photograph was found in the pocket of this German officer, and on the back of the photograph was written in German, the last Jew in Vinica. Near Vinica, the Germans built a bunker for Hitler, the East Front bunker, from where Hitler was supposed to direct the war, the last attack on Moscow in Soviet Russia at that time. In preparation for his arrival and inauguration of the bunker, the Germans soldiers killed all the Jews in Vinica. Actually, one of the most horrific things occurred at the local maternity, where the German officers entered the maternity hospital and asked for the Jewish mothers in labor, which they were identified. They shot all the Jewish mothers. Then they asked, where are the Jewish babies born? The Jewish babies were identified. They were taken and thrown into sacks. The sacks died and thrown from the 2nd and 3rd floor of the hospital into the street, just like unwanted kittens. Children were born at all the concentration camps, just like I was born in Bersat, the German concentration camp. Here are pregnant women at Auschwitz. Over 3,000 babies were born at Auschwitz. And there were 2 midwives. One of them, which was an absolute saint, Stanislava Leżinska, a Polish nun who was also deported there. She was asked to do all these deliveries and instructed to drown the babies, basically killed. She, by and large, refused, and many of the babies that she saved by sending mothers on gurneys and covered with newspapers between the legs of the mothers have survived. about a dozen or so of these babies, Jewish babies, got together at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem a couple of years ago. Polish babies that were delivered, they are non-Jewish babies, were sent out for adoption to German officers, and some of them may have been Jewish, so there may be some Jewish blood among Germans, who knows. For a while, Bersat served also the command center for one of the death squads, Einsatzgruppe B, under the command of Otto Ollendorf, here in the front row to the left. Otto Ollendorf, like most of the people and most of the members of these killing squads, were highly educated individuals. Otto Ollendorf had a degree in economics. He had a doctoral degree in economics. One of the other leaders of the death squad, Otto Rasch, had 2 doctor's degrees, and they used to insist to be called doctor. They should have been called criminal, because Ollendorf alone was found responsible for the murder of 90,000 Jews at the Nuremberg trials after the war. One of the tasks of the death squads were also to chase the Jewish partisans, the Ukrainian Jewish partisans. They were operating in the area, and you may have seen some movies, including the Jewish, that tell a story about the heroic action of the Jewish partisans during the war. The Einsatzgruppe D, that was D, found out that people in the Bersat camp were collaborating with the partisans, and they knew that 2 teenagers were liaisons to these partisans and had a list of the people collaborating with the partisans. They tortured them and finally were able to find that list and took out the people in the concentration camp and Bersat that were collaborating with the partisans. Among the people taken out for execution, one thing to mention, though, you have to be aware that international organizations like the Red Cross were well aware of what was happening in all these concentration camps, and they did very little to help the Jewish people and prevent the murder of millions of Jews during World War II. Among the people taken out for execution near Bersat for collaborating with the partisan was also my father. However, the execution occurred in the local cemetery. My father had the intuition when they got to the cemetery, because there were bodies lying all over, to fall to the ground. And the soldiers did not notice there, and he pretended to be dead, and he remained not moving there on the cemetery overnight, and he returned to the structures where my mother and I was there. This is the letter actually given to my father, written in Russian, given to my father by the Jewish partisans, acknowledging his collaboration with the partisans during World War II. This is a letter from Yad Vashem acknowledging the receipt of the letter, which is on display occasionally at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. This is how the Bersat Jewish Cemetery looks today. It's by and large not taken very good care of them. There are only 2 Jewish people in that town in Bersat. And This is a monument raised in the memory of the people that were massacred and the cemetery, Jewish people that died in Bersat. 1941, about 2,600 were murdered each day in those territories. Later on, 2043, there were less and less Jews, only about 400 a day. Many Jews from those territories were also sent to the concentration camps in Poland and gas there. 5% of those in Transnistria died of hunger, of disease, typhoid and typhus. I myself had typhus and had some scars on my head from the disease manifestation. It is estimated that as many as 2.5 million Jews perished in the Ukrainian camps, not known to this day how many. Just like in Bersat, people were hiding in the places occupied by the Nazis, and they were able to escape capture. Others were not able to escape capture. In 1943, the Red Army victory at Stalingrad. In October of 1944, the camp where I was born was liberated, and I was liberated myself. Just to share with you before I conclude my talk, a funny anecdote. When the camp Bersat was liberated by the Red Armies, the soldiers were under strict orders not to allow any of the deportees of the refugees to get on the trucks because they were afraid of disease. My mother, who was quite charming, and she was fluent in Russian, she also had a degree in Russian literature, not just piano. He was able to convince a group of soldiers to allow her, my father, and I, of course, to get on one of the trucks and to get to the first train station, Mogilev. And while on the truck, one of the soldiers felt sorry for me and pulled out a piece of chocolate, and he gave it to me. And since I never had solid food before, I did eat the chocolate and made a grimace. And all the soldiers burst in laughter and told my mother, "Don't worry, he will grow up, your son will grow up and become a great commander in the Red Army." My mother, who was trained as a musician and she never missed a beat, replied, "No, my son will become a doctor." And I heard that story so many times that I had no choice. I did become a doctor. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I will be happy to answer any question that you may have.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us this morning, afternoon. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box on Zoom. And those watching on Facebook as well can type your questions in the comments. When did you start sharing your story with people?
Thank you for the question. Actually, it was not until later, after I already graduated from medical school, and I had an interest in medical ethics and the origin of the informed consent. One thing that it's not very commonly known also by physicians, that the judges at the Nuremberg trials, at the trial of the Nazi physicians, have mandated that no procedure would be ever conducted on a human being without consent. This was the origin of the informed consent. Not too many physicians, not too many people know that the informed consent was, that the medically informed consent originated at the Nuremberg trials. This time during my career as an academic physician and teaching medicine, I also had an interest in medical ethics, and during my talks, I also started sharing a little bit about my background, and later on I was asked to also share my life journey, which I did share with you today. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. How did this trauma affect your medical career?
Well, I have to mention that I had also some personal issues. For years, I used to have nightmares and wake up in the middle of the night that I'm going to be killed. This lasted for many, many years into my adult years. In terms of my medical career, I always knew that I wanted to become a doctor, and my life journey took me through different countries. My first languages were German and Russian. Then when the communist Russians started deporting Jews to Siberia for being capitalists, ironically, the Germans called them communists, but the communists called them capitalists, and deporting them to Siberia, my parents ran into Romania. In Romania, we spent there about a dozen of years. I learned my third language, Romanian. Then my parents were able to run away from Romania for 14 years, or so, I believe, from Romania to the States. We came to the States in 1960. English became my fourth language. A few months in New York, while walking on a street of Madison Avenue, my parents observed a plaque on one of the doors of a restaurant. There was an inscription: "No dogs, no Negroes, no Jews." When my parents saw that, they said, "We're out of here," and we moved to Israel. Hebrew became my fifth language, and I had yet to finish high school. To this day, I consider my biggest academic accomplishment in life having finished high school in Israel in a year and a half. My college years, though, I did in Italy. I married my wife, with whom we studied together medicine, pre-med in Italy, and then we finished medical school in Israel. So Italian was my fifth, sixth language. So I do speak a lot of languages, each of them is an accent.
Thank you so much for the answer. What happened to your father, and when did both of your parents pass away, and where?
My parents survived the concentration camp. They survived the deportations, to escape actually the deportations from Chernovitz, from Ukraine to Siberia, and we moved to Romania, and we all immigrated to the States in 1960. Then we moved to Israel, and both my parents died years later in Israel. I came after I finished my medical school and worked in Israel for a few years as a physician. I came for advanced medical training to this country, and somehow academic opportunities came my way that were difficult to let go. So I had a very successful rewarding academic career.
Can you please tell us about your wife and how you met and her background?
My wife was a native Israeli, Michal. Michal was born in near Tel Aviv, and we met during our army service. We were both soldiers. We decided to study together, and we did our pre-med school years in Italy and medical school in Israel. And she specialized in later on psychiatry, and I was specialized in high-risk obstetrics, medical and surgical complication of pregnancy. We have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. 2 of our children also choose to go into medicine. And our third younger daughter, who is now in New York, she's an attorney.
Thank you. Did anybody else from your extended family survive?
No, my mother's grandparents died during World War II. My grandfather was unable to walk on the Dead March, and he was shot and his body thrown to the side of the road. To this day, we don't know where. My grandmother died of typhus in a concentration camp in Mogilev. My grandparents on my father's side died before the war. My mother had one sister that was deported with her husband and children also to Bersat. She survived the war, and so did her children. My father's brother, he also survived the war. He was also deported and was in the same place like my parents.
Thank you. How did you learn about your grandparents' fate?
Well, my mother actually, I can't remember a day that she would not bring up the suffering during World War II and how guilty she felt all these years that she was not with her grandparents when they were sent on a dead march. She thought that if she would have been with her parents, she could have saved them. I doubt that, but she always had those horrible guilt feelings. They did not survive. As I mentioned to you, my grandparents on my father's side died before the war. He had his sister. During the early war, she ran away with her husband to Uzbekistan, and his brother was also deported to Bersat with my parents.
Since you were so young when this happened to you and your family, do you remember at what point and what it was like as a young child, eventually becoming a teenager and an adult, to discuss this with your parents? And when they would tell you about your background, your birth, and all your experiences together?
Well, the earliest recollection that I have is that story about that Red Army soldiers pulling a piece of chocolate and giving it to me. I heard that story so many times that memory is embedded. I have memories from my early childhood in Chernovitz, Romania, Ukraine. And then certainly after we came to Romania, I was kindergarten age and so on. And I have many memories. What was the other question, Michael?
Well, just in general, what it was like to discuss this with your parents. If you remember any time sitting down with them, or if it would just come up in other conversations.
Well, my mother, as I mentioned earlier, was not one single day that she would not mention the horrible experience that my father had during World War II. As I said, she felt very guilty that she was not with her parents. So she used to tell me stories and almost not daily, weekly. As I said, she talked about this very frequently. On the other hand, my father rarely talked about his experiences during the war. He once shared one or twice shared with me the story about him being taken out for execution and how he escaped. Another horrendous experience that he had in the camp, and actually described in several books, was that the commander of the camp was a young Romanian fascist soldier, officer called Generaro, who on his spare time or his pastime, he will catch inmates from the camp and tie them to his motorcycle and drag them behind the motorcycle around the camp. And that happened to my father once. My father was he was an athlete and an excellent physical shape, and he was able to survive, although with many bruises, that horrible experience. But those were the only things that my father will mention to me. He's being taken out to the execution and being dragged the motorcycle, but rarely talked about the experiences during the war.
Thank you very much. Do you know in general what it was like to survive on a daily basis for the year or so that you were there?
From my mother's description, the most difficult thing was not the beatings, not even the fear of being executed, not the disease, but hunger. My mother, and then I heard it from other people that survived, hunger was the most horrible thing that they had to survive, that they had to endure. And I can understand that hunger is a horrible experience.
And so your choice to become an obstetrician, was this, why, can you please talk about how this became your field of medicine and why?
Well, my mother described to me my birth many times. It was a very difficult birth. It was a bridge delivery. And it was a complicated bridge delivery. I came into this world with my feet first. Luckily, there was a doctor in the camp. His name was Dr. Menschel. And though he was not an obstetrician, somehow he saved my life. So I heard that story many times, that I wanted to myself help women and specialize in high-risk obstetrics, which was my field of expertise. And it was a very rewarding career for me.
We have a comment here from one of our viewers who says, "You and your children have had such success in spite of all that you and your family have endured. Your resilience is incredible." Thank you for that comment. And of course, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, not just today, but on such a regular basis, to teach students this history. And anybody who participates in our museum programs can now learn from your family's story. To conclude, and I know you've mentioned this a little bit throughout your talk already, why is it important for you to do this on such a regular basis?
I think that one thing that is very sad is the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And particularly in this country, it's hard to believe that 60% of all the racial events are directed at Jews in this country, considering that only 2% of the population is Jewish. Particularly resurgence of anti-Semitism on college campuses, and it's very sad. It's very sad. I hope to meet you at one of the events, and thank you for attending.
And as mentioned, our museum was founded by Holocaust survivors in the 1960s who always wanted to make sure the world would remember this history, and their mission was always to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We cannot fulfill that mission without you and our other survivors, volunteers who do this on a regular basis. We thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Thank you to our audience for listening and for your questions. And again, we're happy to remind everybody that the museum is now open. We are closed Tuesdays and Wednesdays temporarily, but we are open in person. Our talks and programs are still virtual for the time being, so you can follow our website to learn more about those and to learn how you can book a visit online to the museum in person. So we thank you so much, everybody. Wishing everyone a happy, healthy, and safe weekend ahead. Thank you, Raul, for everything you do.
Thank you, Michael, and for all doing the activities at the museum.